Hi, my name is Vishal Prasad and I welcome you to the Scrum Framework video course. This course has not just been designed for beginners but also for experienced Scrum practitioners who wish to reappraise their knowledge of the Scrum Framework. During this course, we will not just refer the Scrum Framework, rather deep dive into the practical implementations of Scrum. In the upcoming modules, you will learn about the elements of Scrum, the roles, the artifacts, the events, and the rules that bind all of them together. We will address common challenges faced by Scrum practitioners and look at how we can address them based on a certain context. We'll also take a look at anti-patterns, which are very common across Scrum teams, and also see organizations which have delivered Scrum products in a successful manner. I do believe that mastering Scrum is not as simple as the framework itself, but I also believe that Scrum is one of those frameworks which can help teams build complex products in a much better way. By the end of this course, you would have gained a deeper insight of the Scrum framework and also be aware of the dysfunctions that lay around the Scrum framework with many of the teams. So I welcome you to deep dive into the fantastic world of Scrum. Let's briefly take a look at the Scrum framework. Scrum is a process framework used to build complex products. It comprised of Scrum teams, their associated roles, events, artifacts, and the rules that bind all of these together. The entire Scrum framework is based on the empirical process model, or empiricism, and the three pillars of empiricism are transparency, inspection, and adaptation. The transparency in Scrum is provided by the artifacts, and events provide formal grounds for inspection and adaptation. And these three pillars are guarded by Scrum values, values of commitment, courage, focus, respect, and openness. Every team member is expected to imbibe these values and together build complex products which are successful and done along with collaboration with their key stakeholders. Scrum is an iterative and incremental framework. And at the heart of Scrum, it's the sprint. A sprint is a time-boxed event of a month or less, and it's called a container event. Within this container, the development team converts requirements into done increments and also perform other events. The definition of what a done increment means is defined by the definition of done. Now, this is a shared understanding between the team members to understand what kind of quality a product is expected to have. A development team is usually 3 to 9 people. That's a recommended size. But you might have a network of development teams working together on a product, which means an increment will be a collective sum of all the integrated increments created during a sprint by all of these network teams. Every increment is completed as per the definition of done, such that they can be released immediately if needed. This process of creating done increments repeats every sprint, and a new sprint starts as soon as the old one is completed. The details of the requirements for building an increment is maintained in a product backlog. This is an ordered list of everything that is needed in a product and is managed effectively by a person called the product owner. Now, product owner is a single person, it's not a committee, and they are responsible for effective backlog management, which they do through an activity called product backlog refinement. The product backlog refinement can happen in isolation or along with the entire team. It is the act of adding details, estimates, and an order to the product backlog. Although the product owner may have the development team perform these activities, the accountability of the product backlog and the product lies with the product owner always. The development team works on product backlog items every sprint, and a sprint starts with a sprint planning meeting. This is an 8-hour time-boxed event for a month-long sprint. And over here, the product owner and the development team decide what ready items can be built. And this is based on the capacity and the past performance of the team. And at the same time, the development team decides how these selected elements or items will be converted into a done increment. During this event, the product owner and the development team inspect the product backlog and craft a sprint goal. They also derive how the sprint goal will be achieved, and that is added in the sprint backlog, which is a transparent artifact, and it provides the progress of the development team throughout the sprint. Once the 8-hour time box expires, the team is off to work their magic in order to create the increments. It is required that the sprint goal is not endangered throughout the sprint. And for this purpose, the development team meets once every 24 hours to track their progress towards the sprint goal. This is done in the daily Scrum meeting. This is a key inspect and adapt meeting that happens for 15 minutes every day at the same place. During this event, the development team inspects the sprint backlog, tracks the progress towards the goal, and if needed, adapts the sprint backlog and their plan to deliver the increment. At the end of the sprint, the Scrum team performs a sprint review. Now, sprint review is a 4-hour time-boxed meeting for a month-long sprint. This meeting is attended by the Scrum team and any relevant stakeholders who are invited by the product owner. During this event, the product owner discusses the product backlog items which were done and which were not done. At the same time, the development team showcases what was completed, and then the stakeholders and the Scrum team together inspect the current product backlog, the marketplace, the capabilities, the skills, the current increment, and finally adapt the product backlog. A sprint ends with the sprint retrospective meeting. This is a 3-hour time-boxed event for a month-long sprint. And during this meeting, the team inspects how the last sprint went. The inspection is done across people, processes, tools, and any improvements that are identified are added to the planning of the next sprint. This diagram represents the Scrum Framework, and this is promoted and supported by one of the most important roles in Scrum called the Scrum Master. Now consider the Scrum Master as a modern manager. They are responsible for managing the project in a Scrum way, and they are servant leaders. They serve the product owner by helping them with effective backlog management. They serve the development team by removing impediments that are in way of their development process. At the same time, they serve the organization to understand Scrum as a process and adoption of that Scrum process within the organization. Together, these immutable rules, events, artifacts, and all the rules form what we call the Scrum Framework. To summarize, Scrum is a lightweight process framework. It's simple enough to understand, difficult to master. The simplicity is evident that the Scrum Framework can actually be explained in less than 10 minutes. The implementation, however, comes with its own challenges. In the upcoming modules, we'll deep dive into the elements of Scrum and see how these implementations can be tackled, starting with the purpose of Scrum. Hi, welcome back to my course on the Scrum Framework. In this section, we shall discuss about the purpose of Scrum. Now, when it relates to the purpose of Scrum, Scrum has been used to develop complex products since the early 90s. And Scrum is a framework, which means it employs various other processes and techniques within itself in order to deliver these products. But what does a complex product really mean? And what theory is Scrum actually based on? What values must a Scrum team exhibit in order to make sure that these products are being delivered and they are valuable to the customers? In this section, we shall deep dive into these topics. Scrum is based on the empirical process control theory, or empiricism. Empiricism requires that at regular intervals, the process feeds some inputs based on which the plans may be adapted in the future. This is based on the 3 pillars of empiricism: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Transparency in Scrum comes from the artifacts. It is necessary that the crucial aspects of this process is available to the key stakeholders of this entire process. At regular intervals, it is required that the Scrum team inspects these artifacts and based on these inspections, adapt the execution plan. During inspection, care must be taken to make sure that the inspection does not happen so frequently that it affects the progress of the entire team. An inspector usually determines if one or more aspects of the process has deviated beyond control and then makes adjustments to minimize the deviation. Scrum provides 4 formal events for inspection and adaptation: sprint planning, sprint retrospective, sprint review, and the daily Scrum. The usual question that comes up is, who inspects and who adapts? Every Scrum event has defined elements that have to be inspected and the people who are responsible for inspecting it. For example, the daily Scrum is an event where the sprint backlog is inspected by the development team and the plan is again updated in the sprint backlog by the development team. So care needs to be taken that if there are certain stakeholders during the daily Scrum who are not responsible for this inspection adaptation, do not disturb the process. This is usually taken care by the Scrum Master. But then again, it is not necessary for the Scrum Master to attend the daily Scrum, which means that the Scrum Master has to teach the development team to stay within the time box and make sure that external disturbances do not impact the inspection adaptation of the sprint backlog during the daily Scrum. We'll take a look at how this can be managed when we discuss specific events. For now, let's move on to understand why do we really need empiricism? And the short answer is to build complex products. What is a complex product? A complex product, in a simple sense, is a product where you have more unknowns than knowns. But how do you determine if there is a product that you're building which has more unknowns than knowns? There are a few frameworks which you can utilize in order to assess this. You can have the Kinnevian framework, which basically tells you if a particular problem lies in the simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic domain. There's also the chaos report by the Standish group, which determines how you actually figure out if you are working in the complex domain. Let's consider that there are three constraints which you need in order to identify your domain. You have if you know the problem well or not, you need if you know the solution well or not, and then you need the skills. Let's consider these three constraints to identify what a complex problem means. Let's say that you want to change a light bulb. The problem is pretty simple. It's defined. You have to change a light bulb. You understand what the problem is. There is only one solution to it. You purchase a light bulb, you unscrew the old one, and you screw the new one. Do you need any specific skills for this? Not really. Maybe a ladder. Since you know the problem, you know the solution, and no specific skills are required, you're basically falling in a simple problem domain. Let's consider the complicated domain. Let's consider that you want to provide some kind of level 1 support. You usually know the problem because the problem is written in a manual which you have to refer to provide the solution. So you know the problem, you know the solution, you may still need certain skills in order to tell the user what the problem is and how they can resolve it by themselves. These kinds of problems will fall in the complicated domain. Now consider the third one. In this particular scenario, let's say that you're building a software. Now usually when you're building the software, the vision that is provided is that you want to solve a certain problem. But the problem is not really the problem that you need to address. The problem is where the organization wants to see themselves in a few years. In which case you have to probe into the problem and understand what is the root cause of the problem before you can provide a solution. So in this case, the problem is unknown. So if the problem is unknown, the solution will obviously be unknown, and you need specific skills in order to probe into these solutions and these problems. This is where the complex problem domain lies. And if you have more unknowns than knowns, you're basically in a complex domain. Now, why would you need empiricism in a complex domain? Because in a complex domain, you need to identify where you are and then adapt what you want to do next. What happens if you actually try and address a complex domain with simplistic frameworks? Let's say a simpler one, waterfall. The feedback cycle that you really require in order to assess your progress and then adapt to it simply becomes longer and longer based on your phase gate model. If you utilize Scrum, you can frequently inspect your progress and adapt to the situation, and your sprint, which is a month or less, can actually reduce the risk that you employ in, say, other methods like waterfall. It is important to identify in which domain your problem lies. Say, for example, applying Scrum in a domain that is not complex. Does it really affect? Well, not really. You can still solve a problem using Scrum which is not in the complex domain, but it brings its own overheads. Take, for example, do you really want to utilize Scrum Framework in order to change a light bulb? Think about that. And it's probably easier to get the answers if your problem actually lies in the complex domain if your team exhibits certain behaviors. Let's discuss about these behaviors in the next section with Scrum values. Let's start this section with one of my favorite books, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. If you're aware with his work, he basically provides a triangle of all the dysfunctions that a team might have and has 5 levels. The very first level is absence of trust. Believe it or not, but this is one of the dysfunctions that most of the teams have most of the times in every organization. There are others as well. You have fear of conflict, lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and inattention to results. Let's say that your team has these dysfunctions as well. How would you resolve these? Well, Scrum Teams and Scrum theory provide Scrum values in order to address these dysfunctions. And there are 5 values in Scrum. You have commitment, focus, courage, openness, and respect. Every Scrum team member is committed towards results. This is one of the values that is slightly misunderstood. Let's consider that we are at a sprint planning meeting. Usually we say that the team commits to the amount of work that has to be done in a particular sprint. That becomes one of the points that whatever we have said during the sprint planning meeting must be completed by the end of the sprint. Yeah, that is the plan, but it may not happen. Take for example, let's say that you are one of the team members of the basketball team. Now your team is supposed to play at a league that has 20 games, and in order for you to win the finals, you have to win at least 17 games. Let's say that the team was unable to win 17 games and won only 16. The 4 games which the team lost, can you name one of the team members who was not committed during that game? It's hard to say. The team members are always committed during deliveries. They are committed to provide results. There are reasons why that may not happen. That does not mean that the team is not committed. And this is one of the Scrum values. Let's take a look at focus. Every sprint has a goal. And it is important to make sure that this sprint goal is not endangered. Whenever someone approaches the team with a request, and if that request lies outside of the sprint goal, the team has the right to ask them to step back. This is what defines focus. And in order to do that, they need courage. Every Scrum team member has the courage to do this. They are open with their conversations with all their stakeholders and the product owner, and they make sure that they do all of these things in a respectful environment. This is what becomes the Scrum values, and every team member is expected to imbibe these values. Let's understand what are the advantages of these values. Commitment. Teams which are committed to results do better. We have seen that happen all the time, and humans are complex. These are the aspects which make a difference between a successful and an unsuccessful product. Focus. Sprints are small. We need to focus on something that gives true value. If everything in your product backlog is valuable, then everything is equally not valuable. Focus is something that helps you move towards progress. Courage. And this can only happen if you respect each other's views and make sure that the only thing that is benefiting out of all the conflicts is the product, and that is on the path of progress. So those are the 5 values of Scrum: commitment, focus, courage, openness, and respect. To summarize, in this section we discussed the empirical process model and why it is necessary to have this for building complex products. We also looked at the Scrum values, which is necessary to build the right products in the right way. In the next section, we'll address what are the various Scrum elements that helps us achieve this purpose of Scrum. Hi, welcome back. Let's continue talking about the Scrum Framework. In this section, we shall discuss about the elements of Scrum. Now, Scrum basically has 3 major elements. You have the roles, events, and the artifacts. And the Scrum Guide provides the rules that bind all of them together. There are 3 roles in Scrum. You have the product owner, the development team, and the Scrum Master. Each of these roles has a set of responsibilities and are accountable for certain outcomes. There are 5 events in Scrum. The sprint, which is a container event for the remaining 4. You have the sprint planning, the daily Scrum, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. And then there are the artifacts. And there are 3 artifacts that provide transparency when it comes to the Scrum framework. You have the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the product increment. Together, these become the elements of Scrum. Let's get into the details of these and see how the elements of Scrum bring all of the Scrum rules together, and that becomes the basis of your game. In this section, we'll discuss about the various roles of a Scrum team. Now, a Scrum team is basically a group of individuals who are cross-functional and self-organized. Self-organization is something that comes only with practice. A Scrum team is self-organized. That means that they have the autonomy to decide how to convert every requirement into a finished product, the increment. And there are 3 roles that are there in the Scrum framework that help us do this. You have the product owner, the development team, and the Scrum Master. Let's see what are the responsibilities and accountability of each of these roles. The first Scrum role that we have is the product owner. The product owner is responsible for maximizing the value of work delivered by the development team. They are the ones who are accountable for the results. A product owner is a single person, and although they may represent the views of a stakeholder committee, it always needs to be a single person so that any conflicts can be resolved with regards to the requirements that have to be developed by the development team. Their responsibilities include clearly expressing the product backlog items, order the product backlog items such that the highest valuable items are at the top, ensure that the product backlog items are well understood and are clear and transparent to everyone in the Scrum team and any stakeholders who are responsible for the success of the product. No one can force the development team to work on any requirements other than the product backlog, and that's the responsibility of the product owner. Let's take an example of what product ownership really means in a Scrum team. Let's say that a sprint is ongoing and has a sprint goal to achieve result A. You have a product owner who's, let's say, someone responsible in the marketing department, and they are making sure that the product that is being delivered for the marketing department is being delivered in collaboration with the people who are working in the Scrum team. One day, the CEO of the organization comes in and asks one of the development team members to do a very urgent task that is crucial for the marketing department. What do you think that the development team member should do? It's a tricky question because the CEO is the person who's sitting right at the top of the organization, and a product owner is probably just someone who's working in the marketing department. But that's the key where the Scrum value comes into picture. Courage. The development team member needs to portray courage in order to make sure that they are developing only the things which are mentioned in the product backlog and nothing else. In fact, everything that is selected in the sprint backlog is the only thing that the development team is going to work on in a particular sprint. At the same time, the CEO needs to understand that the product owner is someone whose decisions have to be respected when it comes to development of a product. This is the importance of a product owner in any organization. The next role in the Scrum team is the development team. The development team are responsible for converting the requirements from the product backlog into done increments. These are professionals who are self-organized and cross-functional. They are the ones who decide how these requirements from the product backlog will be converted into done increments, and no one, not even the Scrum Master, who is a modern manager, can direct them how to do it. Scrum does not have any titles for people in the development team, and they do not have any sub-teams as well. Although it might happen that people in the development team have specialized skills, but the accountability of delivering a done increment at the end of every sprint lies with the complete development team. The size of the development team in Scrum is supposed to be small, and it's been observed that people between 3 to 9 is a good team size to have. It improves communication and helps with better product delivery. This size does not include the product owner and the Scrum Master unless they are also working on product backlog items. It's quite common for teams to have more than 3 to 9 people. In fact, a product can be built by multiple teams with hundreds of people in it. What's needed is to make sure that when these teams are working on the same product, you still have just one product backlog and only one product owner who's directing the work that has to be accomplished. Let's consider an example of what it means to be a development team member. Let's say that there is a user story in your backlog, which, by the way, is just one of the items that you can have in your product backlog. But this user story is, let's say, to build a login screen. And there are multiple activities that will be needed in order to make this login screen. You might have some business analysts who are identifying various ways of authentication. You might have developers who are actually coding for it. You might have testers who are testing this functionality. But at the end of the day, the story is done only when all of these work items have been completed. This is the accountability of the development team. Having specialized skills within the development team is completely acceptable. What is not acceptable is having done requirements for every functional group. This is the accountability of the development team. The final role that we have in Scrum is a Scrum Master. Now, I usually call Scrum Master the modern manager, and that kind of makes people misunderstand what I mean. The Scrum Master is actually a manager, but not the typical project manager that you might get from, let's say, Project Management Institute or Prince 2 definitions. They are modern managers and they help manage projects in a Scrum way, basically by being a servant leader. They serve the product owner, they serve the development team, and they serve the organization. For the product owner, they help product owner find techniques for effective product backlog management. They make sure that every detail in the product backlog is well understood by everyone else in the team, and they help the product owner facilitate any of the events which are requested by them. For the development team, they are the ones who create the safety net. They are the ones who make sure that any impediments in the way of the progress of the development team is removed. They make sure that any events that needs to be facilitated for the development team has been taken care of, and they coach the development team to be self-organized and cross-functional. For the organization, there might be parts of the organization which have to interact with the development team, and since they are oblivious to Scrum, they may not understand which of their interactions are best suited for the Scrum team. This is where the Scrum Master comes into picture. They help the organizations create a bridge between Scrum teams and parts of the organizations which do not employ Scrum. At the same time, they help plan, lead, and coach the Scrum adoption process in the organization. That's a Scrum Master. They are masters of the Scrum process. They make sure that the Scrum process is followed and make sure that it is effective in the best possible way. We usually say that the Scrum Master provides a safe environment for the development team to do their work. It's funny with that concept because safe environment basically means an environment where the development team is allowed to do unsafe work. And that is the truth. Let's consider one of the examples. Let's say that you have a team of 30 people. As a Scrum Master, how would you divide these 30 people into 3 teams? If at any point of time you have an answer that you will try and get the capabilities of all of the development team members and then divide them equally, well, that's something that the Scrum Master is not supposed to do. That's possibly the resource allocation that you're thinking from project managers that comes with the PMP examinations. A Scrum Master is a skill facilitator. If you have 30 people on a team and you have to build a product, it is a Scrum Master's responsibility to get all of these 30 people and the product owner together, have the product owner provide the vision of the product, and then let the team self-organize to understand how best they can divide themselves to deliver a product. And this self-organization can have every sprint if needed. Well, it may not be the best, but it's possible. Teams decide how they are going to deliver, not the Scrum Master. And this is something that is very crucial. Scrum Master is responsible for coaching cross-functionality and self-organization to the development team. So the question comes then, what is the success metrics of a Scrum Master? Well, there is one of the success metrics which is quite popular, which says one of the Scrum Master's job is to make themselves redundant. I really don't believe in that for one simple reason. The moment you make the Scrum Master redundant, you do not have a process master, which means all the impediments which are possible to happen will ultimately happen. If you have that kind of metrics in your organization, it's possible to rethink about those metrics. A Scrum Master is the master of the process that makes sure that the safety net always exists. To summarize, the 3 different roles in a Scrum team are the product owner, who's responsible for making sure that the value of the product is maximized and accountable for the results of the product. They also take care of the stakeholder management. You have the development team, who's responsible for turning the product backlog items into releasable increments every sprint. And you have the Scrum Master, who's the modern manager who acts as a servant leader and provides services to product owner, development team, and the organization. These are the 3 roles of Scrum. Now, all of these 3 roles interact frequently in a sprint through events. Let's discuss those in details in the next section. Hello. In this section, we'll be discussing about Scrum events. Scrum events are designed to create regularity and rhythm for the entire Scrum team. Scrum events are also used to minimize the number of meetings and improve the effectiveness of the entire Scrum team. All the Scrum events in Scrum are time-boxed, which means that they can end before the time box expires, but not after. The exception to that rule is the sprint. The sprint is always of the same duration, and we shall discuss about that in detail in this section as we go along. Sprint is a container event. All the other events of Scrum happen within the sprint, and these are formal events for inspection and adaptation. Failure to have any of these Scrum events reduces the effectiveness of Scrum. Let's see in detail what these events are all about. The very first event in Scrum is the sprint. Sprint is a container event. The duration is a month or less. If the question is how do we determine the length of the sprint, well, it may depend on how frequently you want to receive feedback from your customers, and it may also depend on how frequently the market conditions are changing. Based on that, you may select an appropriate length of your sprint. But once selected, this length remains consistent throughout the working time of the product. During a sprint, the development team creates a done, usable, potentially releasable increment. A new sprint starts as soon as the previous one ends. There are no breaks. And during the sprint, it is ensured that the sprint goal is not endangered in any way. During a sprint, the product owner and the development team may renegotiate the scope of the sprint, but the sprint goal does not change. This ensures that high-quality increments are delivered at the end of every sprint. Now consider sprint as a project. If a project runs with a time box of 30 days, you're also managing your risk to only 30 days. And that's one of the benefits of sprints. You can inspect and adapt your progress after the end of a month, and then determine if it's worth carrying out the project further. That's managing risk with Scrum. Now, sprints occasionally can get cancelled. It's a very rare event, but it may happen, and it's a traumatic one. Let's take, for example, that your team is building a new tax component, and a new taxation rule comes into picture because of which your current development does not make sense anymore, which means your sprint goal itself is obsolete. In cases like these, the product owner, maybe after discussions with stakeholders and the development team, may cancel a sprint because the sprint goal does not make sense anymore. When a sprint gets cancelled, all the done work is basically reviewed and, if possible, released. The undone work goes back to the product backlog, and the moment one sprint ends, a new one starts. And that happens with the sprint planning meeting, which we'll discuss next. The very first event that happens when a sprint begins is the sprint planning meeting. The sprint planning meeting is time boxed to 8 hours. This is for a sprint that is a month long. So let's say that your sprint is just 2 weeks. If your answer is that in that case your sprint planning meeting will be for 4 hours, well, that's incorrect. The time box is 8 hours. It doesn't matter what is the length of your sprint. As soon as the 8 hours end, your sprint starts. During the sprint planning meeting, the entire Scrum team attends. No stakeholders, just the Scrum team. And the Scrum Master ensures that everyone understands the purpose of this meeting, and this meeting happens. During the sprint planning meeting, we basically discuss two things. What are the things that can be delivered as an increment in this particular sprint, and how will these requirements be converted into done increments? What can be done is decided by the objectives of the product owner, any dependencies if the development team has with other teams, the capacity of the development team, the past performance of the development team, and if any kind of special capabilities are required for delivering certain items. Any ready items which are available for development and fulfill the objective of the product owner can be selected for development in a sprint. The development team discusses how these items will be converted into a working increment, and that is the how portion of the entire sprint planning meeting. The what aspect of the sprint planning meeting provides a sprint goal. This is crafted along with the development team and the product owner. And how these items will be converted into done increments is decided by the development team, which is self-organized. By identifying what can be done in a sprint and how these will be done, the Scrum team is inspecting the product backlog and adapting a sprint backlog. Every sprint is required to deliver a done increment. These done increments are usable and can be released if needed. Let's try and understand how a typical sprint planning meeting may work. The Scrum Master will basically start the meeting by addressing everyone and informing everyone about the purpose of this particular meeting. The product owner provides the objective of the next sprint. Let's say the objective of the next sprint is to create a small module that does a tax calculation for employees of an organization. At this point of time, there will be a backlog where there are a number of items that have to be developed. And a few of these items may relate to this particular objective that the product owner wants to achieve. It's necessary that these items are well defined and understood by the development team in order for them to select these items into the sprint backlog. Once these items have been selected, this crafts the sprint goal. Once the sprint goal has been crafted and the what portion of the sprint backlog has been identified, the development team may form small groups and discuss how these elements will be converted into a done increment. It's not necessary that everything that is selected for development in a sprint planning meeting is discussed. What is necessary is that enough discussion happens for the development team to go back and start working on something. This is the essence of the sprint planning meeting. I'll be sitting down for this one because the next event that we are going to discuss is the daily Scrum. Now, it's majorly known in most of the parts of the industry as the daily stand-up. Well, not necessary. It's just a 15-minute time box event. And what is important is that the entire meeting completes within 15 minutes. Standing up, not that important. In this event, the development team discusses what they will be doing for the next 24 hours. It's a key event for inspection of the sprint goal and adaptation of the sprint backlog. The team basically sees how they are progressing towards the sprint goal, and if any adjustments are to be made to the sprint backlog, this is the meeting where it is done. Well, the team may meet after this daily Scrum for a detailed discussion, but at least the initial discussions happen in this meeting. That's the planning meeting that happens, and it saves a lot of time later. The development team can decide the structure of the daily Scrum. One of the most used structures is what we did yesterday, what we plan to do today, and if we have any impediments. Well, that's just one of the ways of doing it. Impediments, for example, don't need to be reported only during the daily Scrum. They can be reported at any point of time. During the daily Scrum, we just understand what is the progress on removal of that impediment. The Scrum Master ensures that the daily Scrum meeting happens, but it is the accountability of the development team to have it. And no one other than the development team is required during the daily Scrum meeting. In case others do attend, then it is the Scrum Master's responsibility to make sure that there are no disruptions. In case the development team finds out during the daily Scrum that the sprint goal is being endangered, or there's not enough work to actually proceed with the entire sprint, they may have another meeting with the product owner where these things can be discussed, and if any flags need to be raised, can happen. This is the importance of the daily Scrum meeting. At the end of the sprint, the entire Scrum team has what we call the sprint review. This is a 4-hour time box event for a month-long sprint. And during this event, the stakeholders invited by the product owner and the Scrum team collectively inspect the increment. During this meeting, the product owner basically tells everyone what are the things from the product backlog that have been done and which were the things which we could not do for some reason. The development team discusses the challenges that they faced during the sprint and how did they overcome it. The product owner discusses the projections, and the stakeholders provide more insight about the marketplace, and everyone provides inputs towards the timelines, budget, marketplace, and the next possible features to be released which are the most valuable to the product. These things become input to the product backlog, and that is what gets adapted during this event. One of the crucial aspects to understand is that the sprint review is not just a showcase. It's not a demonstration for the stakeholders. This is a key inspect and wrap meeting in which the stakeholders provide feedback to the done increment. This is something that is crucial for the development of the product. We did discuss during the sprint container event section that the length of the sprint is determined by how frequently we want to receive feedback from the stakeholders. This is the event that provides feedback from the stakeholders. Obviously, this is not the only event, but this is one of the most crucial events. And that's the importance of the sprint review meeting. A sprint ends with the sprint retrospective event. This is a 3-hour time box event for a month-long sprint. And this is a formal event where the team inspects itself and adapts its working style. The purpose of this meeting is to discuss how the last sprint went with regards to people, processes, tools, and relationships. Improvements are identified and a plan is created in order to have these improvements in place as soon as possible. What is also identified is the immediate actions which are necessary for the next sprint planning meeting and get implemented in the next sprint. This is the sole purpose of the sprint retrospective meeting. Now, although improvements can happen at any point of time during the sprint, this provides a formal platform where the entire team can look back at how they did and what can be improved in order to improve their process in delivering the increment. This is the importance of the sprint retrospective meeting. Now, there are many ways of conducting a sprint retrospective meeting. One of the most common ways is what should we start doing, what should we stop doing, and what should we continue doing. But there are other methods which can be done. What is important is to identify which aspect of the improvement you want to focus on during this meeting, and then make sure that enough discussion happens and a plan is created so that this particular improvement takes place in the next sprint. The sprint retrospective is a meeting where the team builds trust by improving themselves together. To summarize, in this particular section, we discussed about the Scrum events and how these Scrum events provide a formal platform for inspection and adaptation of various artifacts and the team itself. Let's discuss about these artifacts in the next section. Hi, welcome back to my Scrum video course. In this section, we'll be discussing about Scrum Artifacts. Let's say that there are 3 constraints based on which we identify what we want to do with the product: the knowledge of the problem, the knowledge of the solution, and any special skills that are required. So let's say that there is a problem which is well defined, the solution itself is well defined, and you don't require any special skills for, building the solution. Let's say changing a light bulb. You know what the problem is, and there's just one solution for it, and you don't need any special skills. That's a simple problem. There are, very less unknowns, let's say that. The other type of problem that you can have is something where the problem is well understood, the solution is also well understood, but you need special skills. Let's say, for example, if you are a computer mechanic. If something goes wrong with your computer, usually you receive a beep sound when the desktop starts up. That beep tells you what is the problem with your computer, and then you can resolve the problem. So a special skill is required in order to understand what that beep means. This is a complicated problem. But then understand a problem in the software domain, for example, which happens in most of the industries, where the problem itself is not well understood. If the problem is not well understood, the solution will not be understood at all, and you will need special skills for probing into the problem to understand what it is before a solution can be derived. This is a complex product. Scrum is known for building complex products because it provides you empiricism, with which you can inspect the progress of your product at regular intervals and adapt the solution. It brings in the most natural way of creating products, and hence Scrum is one of the best frameworks out there for building complex products. But what about problems which are not complex and you still want to utilize Scrum for solving it? Well, it may still work, but there might be certain overheads and delays which were not expected. Let's take an example of creating this video. When we started off with this tutorial, we knew that we have to create a video course for Scrum, and we knew about our audience, and we knew all of the steps that are needed in order to create the video till the time we upload this on the website. Your problem is well defined, your solution is well defined, but you still need some specific skills for doing all of this. You're basically in the complicated space. If you introduce Scrum in these kinds of spaces, there might be certain delays because during a sprint, your sprint goal cannot change. Which means that if something goes wrong and you have to change your course of action, you might have to wait for a very long time. But let's say that if you are in the complex space and you're creating a video where you have absolutely no idea what kind of video will be, say, acceptable to the audience. In that case, you have to probe into the details of the information. You have to go out there and get some feedback and then ultimately create some kind of a, say, YouTube video that you want to upload. That's a complex space, and Scrum can totally be used for that kind of a problem. In this section, we'll discuss about the Scrum artifacts. Artifacts provide transparency in Scrum. These are available to the stakeholders who need them for their inspection and adaptation process. There are 3 artifacts that are provided in Scrum which help with this inspection, adaptation, and transparency. They are the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the increment. Let's take a look at these in detail. A product backlog is a list of everything that is needed in order to build a product. It does not contain just the user stories. It contains everything from features to enhancements to fixes, even the test criteria and the test itself which provide the done increment. This is an ordered list with the higher values item at the top. The ones at the top are usually deemed ready for development, which means that they can be completed in one sprint. During the sprint planning meeting, these are the items from the product backlog which the development team and the product owner take into consideration. A product backlog has product backlog items, and the product backlog items have 4 attributes. They have a description, they have an order, they have a value, and they have an estimate. The estimates are provided by the development team because they are the ones who are responsible for turning these product backlog items into done increments. The product backlog is an ever-evolving list. As long as the product exists, the product backlog exists. Although initially the product backlog may be a very small list, but as the sprints progress, more feedback gets added into the product backlog as product backlog items. There might be multiple teams that are working on the same product, in which case all of these refer the same product backlog. The product backlog is the only source from where all the development teams work, and no one can direct the development teams where they should work from other than the product backlog. Let's understand the evolution of the product backlog with an example. Let's say that you're in your very first sprint. During this sprint, you may have just a few features that are listed which have to be developed. The Scrum team together decides what can be done and how will these be done during the first sprint planning meeting. As your sprints progress, there will be some feedback that will be added to the product backlog. And after the end of the first sprint, you will have more feedback from the stakeholders from the sprint review meeting, which will ultimately adapt your product backlog. This will continue with multiple sprints, and let's say during your third sprint, you need to release your increment. At this point of time, you will have certain release activities which will also be present in your product backlog as well as your sprint backlog for this particular third sprint. And let's say during the fourth sprint, there are some production defects which are identified or some enhancements which have come up, which come into your product backlog again, and these have to be incorporated in your future sprints. This continues throughout the lifetime of a product. The product backlog thus provides transparency to everything that is being done for a product and helps the product evolve itself. At any point of time, the product owner may monitor the progress towards the ultimate goal of the product by looking at the product backlog. There are various instruments that you can use, let's say the burn up chart or the burn down chart or the cumulative flow diagrams that can help you with this process. But what you need to remember is that empiricism means these might change as time flows by. The sprint backlog is basically a subset of your product backlog of the plan that you have forecasted for a particular sprint. It's a forecast. It's pretty usual for many teams to say that it's a commitment, but here's where it might get confusing. You see, the Scrum values say that the team is always committed to deliver. What you have in the sprint backlog is a forecast based on your past performance and any other parameters that may determine how much work can be done in one sprint. The sprint backlog is something that is available and visible only to the development team. They are the only ones who are responsible to update it. An updation may include adding a few items or removing if it's not required. It's not necessary for anyone else to have the visibility of the sprint backlog except for the development team. This is an inspect and adaptation artifact only for the development team. And if anyone questions the development team basically loses focus of development. So this is an artifact that is utilized by the development team to monitor their progress towards a sprint goal. And every day during the daily Scrum, this might get updated based on the feedback that they receive. That is the importance of the sprint backlog. Let's take a look at the final artifact of the Scrum framework. That's an increment. Now, increment is the sum of all the product backlog items of the current sprint as well as all the previous sprints that have happened. So it's basically a part of your product since the beginning of your product development. The increment is always a done increment, which means it can be released if the product owner wants. What do we mean by a done increment is something that we'll discuss during the definition of done. But as of now, think of it as a part of your product that is built by your development team every sprint. In case there are multiple teams which are working on the same product and the same product backlog, the end of the sprint will basically give you an increment which is integrated work of all these teams. This should always be in a releasable state whether your product owner wants to release it or not. An increment is a step towards the overall vision of the product, and it is inspected during the sprint review meeting every sprint. If any changes are made to the product backlog, the results are seen in the increment whenever these product backlog items are pulled into sprints. This is one artifact that is always visible to everyone who's related with the product. This can be inspected during the sprint review and adapted during the upcoming sprints. Now, an increment is always releasable, but here's a question for you to think about. There is a principle in the Manifesto for Agile Software Development which says that Agile teams must release their products from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, which technically means that you should have at least 6 releases every year. Now, if you're working in a Scrum team and you are producing increments every sprint, but you're not releasing once every 2 months, you may still be doing Scrum, but are you still doing Agile? Well, doing Agile itself is an incorrect term. If you really want to follow the principles of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development, then this is something that you need to keep in mind. So increment provides you with this transparency, as well as it is needed that they get released as frequently as possible. This brings us to the last topic of this section, the transparency of artifacts. It is extremely important that the artifacts in Scrum are transparent to the people who require it. It's needed because it optimizes value and it minimizes the risks. Incomplete transparency creates blind spots for the development team and for the Scrum team and the organization in general. People lose focus and direction towards the goal. Hence, it's important that the artifacts are always transparent. It is the job of the Scrum Master to work with the Scrum team and the organization to make these artifacts as transparent as possible. And it is difficult. Transparency does not happen overnight. So the entire Scrum team, with the help of the Scrum Master, must work towards the transparency because it's the only thing that helps with the inspection adaptation of the empirical process. There are various ways with which you can achieve transparency. You can have whiteboards, you can have artifacts on the wall, you can also have electronic material which can help you with improving the transparency of these artifacts. Distributed teams might have electronic artifacts which helps them with monitoring their progress. Whereas teams which are co-located, well, a simple whiteboard might help. But it is crucial that transparency is achieved. To summarize, Scrum provides transparency through 3 artifacts. The product backlog, which provides visibility to the progress of the entire product to the stakeholders and the Scrum team. The sprint backlog, with which the development team monitors their progress. And the increment, with which the organization, the stakeholders, the users, the Scrum team together inspect how the product is progressing. These 3 artifacts provide you all the transparency that is needed when it comes to Scrum teams. In the next section, we'll discuss more immutable rules which are helpful for the Scrum teams to incorporate inspection, adaptation, and the transparency of these artifacts. See you in the next module. Welcome back. In this section, we'll be discussing about the common anti-patterns of Scrum. Anti-patterns are basically things which are against the rules of Scrum, but many teams might still end up doing it because they have a context. But in this section, we'll take a look at how those anti-patterns affect a Scrum team and what are the possible consequences of these anti-patterns. I'll discuss 3 of my favorite anti-patterns in this section: the Scrum but, the Sprint Zero, and the real understanding of what impediments are. Let's get on with it. The first anti-pattern that we'll discuss is called Scrum but. It may not really be an anti-pattern, but it's definitely the basis of many different anti-patterns. And it's pretty easy to identify. If anyone during a sentence says, hey, we do Scrum, but, and anything that follows is basically the anti-pattern. Let's consider this. Let's say that there's a Scrum team that's working towards a product. And it's been many sprints since when they have not had a retrospective. In that case, probably the Scrum Master might say, hey, we do Scrum, but we don't do retrospectives during every sprint. If you're not having sprint retrospectives every sprint, you're basically increasing the time of your feedback for the improvement of your team. What basically happens is that your team misses out on key inspect and adaptation elements that can improve the processes with which the team is working. Scrum has certain immutable rules, and it's immutable for a reason. When all of the elements of Scrum work together, they create synergy. And missing out on these elements will create dysfunctions, which will have effects which are not expected out of Scrum teams. Scrum but is one of these dysfunctions. And what I usually say is when you're a part of a dysfunction, it's really difficult to identify a dysfunction. But in the case of Scrum Bud, it's pretty easy. Whenever you find someone who says a sentence called, "We do Scrum, but," that's basically an indication that you're moving towards a dysfunction. And as a Scrum Master or as a Scrum team, you need to be aware of that and make sure that you can avoid this as much as possible. The good thing is that Scrum is basically a process framework. It's not a technique, it's not a process, but it is a container within which you can employ various different processes. So if you have all of the elements of Scrum working for you, Scrum and provides a much better conjunction than Scrum but. Consider this. If you're a software development team, you may be working in a Scrum environment, implementing all the elements of Scrum, and then you have extreme programming practices which can help you build products in a much better and efficient way. That's what Scrum and is all about, and it's much better than Scrum but. So the next time whenever you hear this sentence, you know what to do. The second anti-pattern that I would like to discuss is also one of the most popular ones in the industry. It's called Sprint Zero. And it almost seems necessary to have it every time. Anytime we start a new product, the very first thing that comes to our mind is that we need to have some infrastructure in place. We need to set up our machines. We need to have certain databases available, and so on and so forth. What is the time to actually do all of these things? Well, Sprint Zero. It may not be of the same length as all of your other sprints, but this is the sprint where you actually set up all of the activities which are needed in order to begin with the development. But Sprint has one and only one condition, that at the end of the sprint, there should be a done increment which is usable and releasable. Sprint Zero does not provide that, and that's why it becomes an anti-pattern. But considering that most of the teams are used to it, how do we move away from it? We have to get into a mode that is called evolutionary architecture. For this, it is required that you have the minimum architecture that is needed in order to build everything that is needed at that point of time. So get rid of Sprint Zero. Let's start with Sprint 1. In the first sprint, identify the elements which provide the highest level of value for your product, and find only the minimum amount of infrastructure setup that is required in order to build this. At the end of the sprint, even if it's very small, you will have some increment in place. And for a few sprints in the beginning, you might have the speed of your team which is not as much as you would expect. But that's all right, you're evolving. And once most of your infrastructure is in place, which might take a few sprints before that happens, your teams will gain the speed that they want. So Sprint Zero might actually help you with the infrastructure setup, but that's something that you can do in an evolutionary way anyway. Let's say that you have one person working in your team, and there's a 10-day sprint in which this person is going to set up all the infrastructure that is required in order to begin with the development sprints. Which means in these 10 days, you would have spent a cost of one person for 10 days without any valuable increment. That's an anti-pattern. It doesn't matter how small the increment is, it is required that every sprint results in an increment. And hopefully, without Sprint Zero, but instead having Sprint 1 as your very first sprint, teams will be able to deliver something valuable with the first sprint. That would be the rule of Scrum. The final topic of this section is understanding impediments. Again, this may not be an anti-pattern, but it definitely is the basis of many anti-patterns. What exactly is an impediment? Let's take an example to understand that. Let's say during a daily Scrum, the Scrum Master is also present for one of the meetings. And during this meeting, one of the development team members says that the build monitor is broken, and that's an impediment for them. What will the Scrum Master do in this case? Consider the second scenario where, again, the Scrum Master is present during the daily Scrum, and the team reports that they need a specialist on the team with Neo4j skills. Which of these do you think is an impediment? The first example, where the build monitor is broken, where the Scrum Master cannot do a lot of things in this case unless the Scrum Master has technology skills. But this is something that the development team can manage by themselves. They don't need any external intervention. That's basically not an impediment. That's probably a technical card that goes on your sprint backlog. But the second scenario, where you need a specialist in Neo4j, that specialist may not be present in the organization. This would be a job for the Scrum Master to find the right resources who can get you this person on board. That would be an impediment if it hampers the progress of the team. And that's how we need to understand the difference between an impediment. An impediment is not something that the development team can solve by themselves. It's something that is beyond the jurisdiction of the development team and needs someone's intervention to get it resolved. Again, The Scrum Master does not resolve the impediment by themselves. They're responsible for removing the impediments. They'll make sure that everything that is needed from enablement to facilitation to remove the impediment is done, but they may not be the people who do it. That would be something that the Scrum Master is responsible for. But understanding the impediments is something that everyone in the Scrum team should have. To summarize, in this section, we discussed about a few anti-patterns. They may not be just anti-patterns, but also the basis of various other anti-patterns. And hopefully the Scrum teams have understood how we can get this resolved. In the next section, we'll be looking at a few organizations who have utilized Scrum to build successful products. See you in the next module. Hi, welcome back to my video course. In this section, we'll be discussing about the immutable rules of Scrum. Now, everything that we have discussed so far are basically the immutable rules of Scrum: the roles, the events, the artifacts, and the interaction between them. It is possible to perform just a part of Scrum and not all of the roles, artifacts, and events, let's say for example. But the total that you get out of this is not really Scrum. Scrum is only whole when it has all of these immutable rules intact. This particular rule is kind of frowned upon by many people. But most of the frameworks actually have immutable rules. Scrum just makes it explicit. It's like a game. Let's say that you have a choice to play basketball or baseball. Once you have chosen which game you have to play, there are some rules that you have to follow, and these cannot be broken. It's the same with Scrum. It's not necessary that you have Scrum implementations only for building products. But if you have selected Scrum, then there are immutable rules which cannot be fiddled with. In this section, we'll look at a few more that were left out. Increments are always done. But what do you mean by done? Done is something that is described by the definition of done in Scrum. And not all the teams may have the same definition of done. It's dependent on the team and sometimes also on the organization. It's a shared understanding in the Scrum team about what a done increment actually means. Especially if you're working with user stories, there might be a confusion between an acceptance criteria and definition of done. Let's try and figure that out. If you're working on a user story which says 1 + 1 should give you 2, that's an acceptance test. That's something that that particular user story must fulfill. But definition of done is for an increment. So creation of release notes for every increment will go in your definition of done. This is what creates the standard of development in all of the Scrum teams. Now, where will you usually find a definition of done? Well, that's an interesting question. If you're the only Scrum team that is working on a product backlog, and your organization does not describe a standard for a product, this definition of done will be built by your team. When the product basically starts, the first sprint planning meeting is probably a place where you'll start building this definition of done. And then during all the retrospectives, you might actually go and update your definition of done based on whatever you have learned. Now consider that you're working in a scale team. If you have multiple teams working on the same product and the same product backlog, these teams might have a common definition of done that applies to the complete product. If a new team starts in this particular scaled environment, they may have to inherit the existing definition of done and then add more items to it based on their team's exclusive requirements. If your organization provides a standard for products that have to be built, the definition of done might come from the organization itself. At this point of time, you will inherit this definition of done based on your product's exclusive requirements. This is where the definition of done can come from. But when is the definition of done really done? During your first sprint, when you plan the definition of done for the very first time, you may have just a few notable factors that you want to involve. But as your sprints progress, more feedback gets added through your retrospectives, and your definition of done can actually change. So the definition of done of your product is also ever evolving. This ever evolving artifact gives you the standard of the work that every Scrum team has to deliver. Now, if we have a definition of done, one might consider that we have a definition of ready as well. But the Scrum guide does not provide any such artifact. Now, why is that? You see, the definition of done is applicable to an increment. It does not matter what you build, the increment is always one product that is releasable. So there's a standard associated with the increment, which is just one type of product that's going out. But when it comes to the product backlog items, well, the product backlog items does not have just features or just user stories. It has features, enhancements, fixes, even tests. A common definition of ready cannot apply to all of these different types of product backlog items. And that's the reason why we do not have one. So what exactly is ready? Ready is basically any product backlog item that can be completed in one sprint, and it is well understood by the development team. As long as this happens, every item that is pulled into a sprint can be deemed as ready. Product backlog refinement is one of the activities with which more details can be added to the product backlog items and they can be made ready for a particular sprint. In the next topic, we'll discuss what the product backlog refinement is. Product backlog refinement is the act of adding details, order, and estimates to the product backlog items. Now, although this is usually done by many of the teams as a whole team meeting, it's not really a meeting. It's just an ongoing activity throughout the sprint. It can be done in isolation with just the product owner doing it, or it can be done along with the team. And there is a sentence in the Scrum guide that says that not more than 10% of the capacity of the development team must be utilized during the product backlog refinement. Well, that's just a number just to indicate that you are not taking a lot of time off the development team from doing crucial work of converting product backlog items into done increments. You can have product backlog refinement done at any point of time at the product owner's discretion. During the refinement process, an order is added to every product backlog item. And the higher the items are in the product backlog, they have more details, better estimates, and these are something which may be ready to be pulled into a sprint. That is why we do product backlog refinement. To summarize, everything that we have discussed in this video so far are the immutable rules of Scrum. It's the interaction between the roles, events, artifacts, everyone who's involved in the Scrum team and the development process, including the stakeholders, and also the definition of done, what ready really means, and product backlog refinement. Everything included is what formulates the Scrum framework. In the next section, we'll discuss common anti-patterns of Scrum teams. And in the upcoming sections, we'll also discuss about various organizations of how they have successfully adopted Scrum in order to deliver products. Welcome back to the final section of this video course. In this section, we'll look at a few success stories of organizations when it comes to Scrum implementations. Scrum is very popular in the software industry. But what you will see in this section is that software is not the only industry where Scrum has prospered. Let's go ahead and look at the first organization that we have. Over the years, I've heard some great stories about success with Scrum. But one of the crucial stories that I've heard is about Salesforce.com. Salesforce, with their transformation programs over the years, have come up with their own adaptive delivery model, or ADM. This methodology has Scrum at its core, and is coupled with various other XP practices and principles and lean principles to drive the entire value stream. Over the years, they have seen a very rapid growth in their business with regards to implementation of Scrum and this entire process. The organization is focused towards delivery with every sprint, and every new hire who joins the company goes through a 2-day training process to understand this entire delivery model. Now, Scrum has been very popular with software organizations, but here's an example for you from the hardware world. Wikispeed. It's a 100 mpg car that is built with open source design, it's modular, it's built without any special equipment, and it's built by volunteers. And the heart of it, Scrum. Scrum is at the core of building this vehicle. Wikispeed has been showcased at various different exhibits, and you can find more details on wikispeed.org. So we have seen software organizations implement Scrum, we have seen hardware organizations implement Scrum. And Scrum is a framework to address complex products. And what can be more complex than the government? The San Jose Office of Civic Innovation and Digital Strategy, that's one of the organization bodies that has adopted Scrum. And they have been delivering their projects with this strategy. According to them, this is the single best and compelling practice that they have adopted over the years that has helped them prioritize their work. With the government, everything is a crisis. And when you're in a crisis situation, how do you prioritize the most important items to be done first? And that's where Scrum Framework helps them. So yeah, Scrum has its origins with software. But over the years, Scrum has been applied successfully in various different kinds of organizations, from hardware till government organizations. And these success stories is what motivates me to apply Scrum with my complex work. Hopefully this has been helpful to you as well.